Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are in the world watching this today, I'm really pleased to be here with you. My name's Kevin Frediani, and I'm today interviewing Yasmin Hales. Hello, Yasmin.
Hello, Kevin. Nice to be here.
Nice. It's really nice to have you here. And today, Yasmin and I are going to try to help share information about and the anthropology of space, place, and landscape with you. Yasmin has just been the most wonderful tutor for me over the last 10 weeks learning about this. And I wanted to share that with you as part of my peer network and beyond it to people who are practicing landscape maintenance, understanding landscapes of space and place, but not necessarily looking at it through the widest lenses because we're all embedded in a discipline, geography being my background, if you like, or horticulture. So as part of that, I'm going to just find out what anthropology is and how it's practiced and how people get into it. But we're also going to give you an opportunity to learn something for yourself. But before I do, I'm just going to ask Yasmin how you are, where you are, and at this point, because of that um, distance between us, just check in and make sure that that you're okay out there in the world today.
Um, well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here. So thank you for the invitation. I'm speaking from London. I, as a social anthropologist, teach across two academic sites. I teach at Goldsmiths, London University, and I am part of the faculty of short courses where I deliver my Anthropology of Space, Place and the Landscape course, which I've been doing for probably the last 3 or 4 years now. But I also teach at an adult college in central London called City Lit, which is where I met you initially as one of my students. And I teach 4 courses here. I teach the introduction to anthropology. I teach the anthropology of space, place and the landscape. I teach the anthropology of art, film and photography, and potentially lots of other segues from that. So yes, so I teach across 2 academic sites. In addition to that, I've also curated a museum exhibition on the basis of my academic research, my research interests in space, place and the landscape. And yeah, I equally act as an anthropological consultant as well.
Yasmin, you obviously have got really interesting background in terms of that teaching, but you didn't always teach anthropology. So tell me, what inspired you to become an anthropologist? Where did that come from?
Well, I come from mixed Asian heritage, actually. So I was given a wonderful opportunity to travel over to India, specifically as a child. And I think either consciously or subconsciously, I started to intake the diversity of colour, space, movement, realised that people in India eat with their hands. They wear a different type of fabric over their bodies, which is called a sari. It's a single piece of cloth that's wound around the body. And I think even, as I started to mature, particularly in my teens and then later on in life, in my 20s, I realised that I wanted to explore further. And so I returned back on a very long, deep immersion for 18 months to travel to South and Southeast Asia. And there I looked at, I travelled to Thailand, Cambodia. I worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta. I worked in leprosy colonies in Nepal. And I also had the opportunity to familiarise myself with my family again in the foothills of the Himalayas in northern India. So I think all of that gave me the opportunity to explore rituals, ceremonies, smells, colours. And I realised that while I was actually exploring the landscape and literally embodying it, I was trying to work through the opportunity and the idea of this world of anthropology, but I didn't know that it had that title at that stage. I came back to London and I contacted SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and I said, well, I've already done my field work, I've just been out there. They said, well, actually, I think some theory would be good. And so I threw myself into a BA Honours in social anthropology at SOAS, where I had some excellent lecturers and teachers. And it was there that I was first introduced to the concept of space, the cultural meaning of space, the psychological meaning of space. And I then went on to research it further.
Gosh, I can see why your own lived-in experience really helps you be a teacher. And I was going to ask you, in terms of a definition, let's ground anthropology and talk about the different types there are. And I wonder if you could help me and others know what that is.
Yes, certainly. So the definition of anthropology is the cross-cultural study of human behaviour, and really that means why people do what they do. Why is it that individuals behave in the way that they do? But when you ask them why they behave in that way, so literally, it could be the tradition of having fish on a Friday, or the importance of rice in a culture, or the concept of body tattoos, or a ritual offering to the landscape. And often this knowledge is passed down from generation to generation, and so it's culturally accepted and it's never challenged. And it becomes very much the practice of everyday life within a culture or a society. And so the work of anthropologists is to try and understand that meaning, to try and contextualise it and say, well, why is it that this happens in Borneo but it doesn't happen in London? And so we have a whole range of different pathways that one can explore. So we have a fourfold pathway in anthropology. So an individual can specialise in one of four areas. So we have linguistic anthropology, which looks at the concept of language and the evolution of the written word, the spoken word, the disappearance of languages, click languages, for example, but equally new words that may be introduced into a vocabulary, such as init, or such as furlough, words that we haven't heard before. And linguistic anthropologists would understand the inclusion, but also regional dialects. Apparently in England, we have a very, very rich belt of regional dialects between Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool. So why is that so? So that would be linguistic anthropology. Biological anthropology is another really important pathway, and that's very much to do with the relationship between humans and animals. So potentially that would be all of the world of David Attenborough. You'd be looking at group behaviour amongst animals, say monkeys, for example, and then look at the mimicry amongst humans, rage, anger, defence mechanisms, but equally it also looks at the human body, obviously, and genetics, etc. So that would be biological path, and then we have the archaeological pathway in anthropology, where individuals would be working on how we lived in the past. So archaeologists may discover a pot, for example, on an archaeological dig and say, look at these wonderful patterns. We need to understand how these people lived and the meaning of these wavy lines and the meaning of the pottery, and why is it that we've discovered them in Mali, but equally they've appeared in Morocco. So we look at the diffusion of patterns and cultures. So archaeological anthropologists would follow that path. And then finally, we have sociocultural anthropologists, which probably forms the largest section, and that very much deals with the practice of everyday life. So rituals, concepts of gender, socio-political organisations, the economics of a society, and there are, I think, approximately 16, 17 faculties in the UK that offer a platform for anthropology in all of its various forms. So they all join up, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, really surprised surprising to me, the breadth of the subject and things that
Mm,
I didn't realize were that anthropology at all. You know, you talk about
yes.
David Attenborough, someone we see familiar on the TV, and then it makes sense when you actually understand what
Mm,
you didn't know before. But I was thinking, in terms of, bringing it down into everyday experiences and actually linking it to your own experiences. Um, can you give examples from your own experience about space and place and how this has changed over time?
mm. Yes, certainly. So when I was doing my undergraduate degree many years ago, I had a lecturer that came in. I still specifically remember that eureka moment. And the lecturer was basically talking about the concept of domestic space in Thailand, and she was talking about the meaning of the home. And she was indicating that amongst this particular indigenous group, the concept of the home had this tripartite structure. So the upper world of the home, the equivalent of the loft, um, or the attic, was associated with the gods. The middle section of the home was associated for humans, and the lower part of the house, i.e. the basement, was only associated with negativity, concepts of purity and pollution, so dirt and animals. And she was just talking about the normality of the way that this particular Thai group lived their life in relation to their space and their landscape. And I suddenly thought, my concept of space is not the same as their concept of space. That means that there are spatial differences within the world. So I rushed off to the library, as one does, full of enthusiasm, and I realised that there was very, very, very little written about the concept of space at that particular time. There was a spatial turn within academia, and this very neglected topic suddenly had come to the fore. And suddenly all the disciplines, many disciplines, were starting to readdress their own understanding of the landscape, but from a spatial perspective. And so suddenly there was a flux and flurry of articles from psychologists, anthropologists, urban designers, and architects as well, trying to understand the sociocultural meaning of space. So I explored it further, and then I continued further research, and I went out to do some research in India, and I realised that in South India, in various parts, their concept of space was classified in relation to the landscape and in relation to the body. And it became very apparent that space, this invisible backdrop to the practice of everyday life, is not natural, but it's culturally constructed. And there are gendered spaces, ritual spaces, political spaces, spaces of displacement, spaces of colonialism, decolonized spaces. And so I began to explore all of them. And yes, I built my platform from there, basically.
I love that concept of a spatial turn, and I think in my own epiphany, if you're like going on at the moment, I think most of those people watching today is going to be COVID, isn't it? Because all of a sudden we have become aware of spaces. Could you tell us
Absolutely.
something about that?
Yeah, so I think it's quite interesting because very much like a Damien Hirst sculpture or an art piece, most people would look at his work and not really understand it. So when I went out to India, and I said, I want to talk to you about your concept of space, they looked really baffled. And even, amongst my colleagues and academics, etc., the fact that you experience space on a daily basis, but you don't consider it. And it's only with COVID that suddenly people get it. They understand that from an anthropological perspective in the 60s, this concept of space was classified as spatial proxemics. And there was a wonderful anthropologist called Edward T. Hall, and he realised that different people orient and move their bodies physically in relation to space in different ways. And he realised that there were 4 concentric circles that individuals have in relation to proximity to each other. And the closest space is for your nearest and dearest, literally sort of 6 inches max. And then beyond that, the next concentric circle would be for family, which is beyond a foot. And then after that, that would be social space. So definitely a coffee table in between 2 individual people, but equally, if you go into a shopping centre and you orientate yourself within a building, and then finally you have public space, which would be a lecture hall, for example. And so what he realised was that those boundaries are porous depending on the culture that was appropriating that experience of space. And so he did some research with Hispanic groups, Europeans, and he realised that there was a spatial choreographic dance. And as he went forward, so many of the cultures stepped back because culturally they felt that they needed this aspect of space. But the most important thing is that there was spontaneity, individuals hug and touch each other, obviously in certain ways. So he was looking at body behaviour. And COVID has changed all of that. So I think that this concept of the psychology of space, bodily space, and the way that space is now being processed and our experience of space has created a sense of emotional awareness on one level, but equally a great set of complications as well, mentally, emotionally, physically, and equally in relation to well-being. So it's a very, very interesting time to explore that from a proxemics perspective.
I mean, in my personal or my professional career, I look after green spaces, spaces between buildings, and obviously they're being used much more than they necessarily were, or they're certainly being valued, if not used more than they were before COVID. But I'm becoming more aware of how an anthropological lens can help me understand personally those spaces and how to improve designing them. But I was just thinking, from your perspective, as someone who has been studying spaces, places, and landscapes for a number of years, how do you think that those who come from different disciplines could better understand an anthropological lens to help them realize or connect to our built environment or our landscapes?
Sure. So I think basically, as with space, the concept of place and landscape is culturally constructed. It's associated with memory, trajectory, narratives, and it's something that societies and cultures create, but again, they may not be aware of that creation. And so from an anthropological perspective, we try to explore different layers. At the moment, obviously, many anthropologists are working with conservationists in relation to recolonising or decolonising the landscape that's previously been colonised, and working with Indigenous groups to understand local knowledge from the inside out rather than imposing it from the outside in. So the role of anthropology, I think, today in relation to an exploration of the landscape is absolutely critical because of climate change, biodiversity. So I think there's an enormous amount of interdisciplinary overlap, dialogue and exchange, and I try to incorporate that on my course.
Now, I can testify to that, and also can add into it gender, of course, because again, being a male in a world which actually has been inherently designed by men, but actually used not just by men, which has caused its own problems. And obviously, if you are only biased in your own world, you don't see that.
Absolutely.
And I think
Forget about the other 50%. Yes.
yeah, absolutely, and to our shame, but again, it's that not seeing and not being given the way of seeing with two eyes, both open at the same time. I'm going to come on to a final question because I mean, I've benefited, and we wouldn't be having this conversation if I hadn't found you and been enriched by that learning. But how can others tap into that rich vein of knowledge? And what would people expect on a course with you?
So basically, I created a new independent platform called Anthropology for All. And what I've decided to do is all of the courses that I discussed previously that I teach on academic platforms, I've decided to teach independently. And so there is a summer course that I am due to deliver, I think just in approximately 2 weeks' time or so, mid-July, on the Anthropology of Space, Place and the Landscape. And so individuals will get a 10-week course which will incorporate a very carefully curated bite-sized introduction to the different concepts of space that we've just been exploring. So spatial proxemics, gendered space, political spaces, domestic space, meaning of home, and all of the wonderful theoretical perspectives, concepts and ideas associated with that. So if individuals are currently enrolled as an academic and potentially going on to do a master's or an MPhil, this is a wonderful interdisciplinary gap for landscape architects, for urban designers, for anthropologists, for artists, for fine artists, for psychologists, a whole range of interdisciplinary pathways. So the sessions will be run for 2 hours once a week, potentially in the evening. And what they would get is the opportunity to learn about this particular platform, understand it, maybe do presentations if they want to. We've got exercises, put a few quizzes together now as well. And then have the opportunity basically to, if they're very interested, equally enrol on independent one-day workshops. So I know that I delivered an anthropology of mapping and indigenous cartography workshop to you. How did you find that, Kevin?
Yeah, again, I think that the overview helped me understand the environment I've been working in and studying for the last 30 years in a different way. And I think the deep dive was just it's a bit like having an ice cream with a topping on top. It allows you to go further and embody some of that learning. You can test it, and I think the workshop was very good because of that blended style of learning that you bring. So yeah, very good for me.
Absolutely. So I think one of the aims basically is to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And if we can take your preconceived ideas, your ethnocentricities, your biases, your prejudice, and start to just quietly remove the layers in a very humble way and look at cross-cultural references and meanings and say that, you know, different cultures do the same as you but in a different way. Let's try and understand that dialogue. That would be a wonderful opportunity to explore the world of anthropology.
Absolutely wonderful. And I love that. What a lovely way to end, saying making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And on that note, I invite you all to do as I did and join Yasmin on a journey which will help you see things in a different way, and I'm sure will enrich your concepts, your designs, your management of those spaces, whether they be built environment, landscape environment, or space or place. Um, Thank you very much for joining us this evening, and can I just say thank you very much, Yasmin?
That's a pleasure. Thank you. I'll leave all the details with you.
Yes, so we'll post at the end of this. There'll be links that you can follow to both websites, Eventbrite, and join and book up. If you want to know a little bit more, you can always approach me, those of you that are seeing me on my social network. But thank you again for listening, and I hope to have deep conversations with you about anthropology of place, space, and landscape in the future.
Look forward to it. Okay, thank you for sharing.
Thank you.